today I'm very privileged to have my old friend Michael Pettis here, who just published a book, of course, in the spirit of the city here. It's about the class war, but of course he talks about the trade war. And I'm very happy that I could convince Martin Wolf, the FT commentator, to be our sparring partner here. Because he wrote a column about the book, using the book as his argument. So I will not speak much further, and maybe I just start and then sort of vanish by asking Michael, this book was written before COVID. What would you write differently as we are in the COVID crisis?
Well, the way I think about the impact of COVID-19 on the global economy and on China and on everywhere else is I don't really see it as some people have said, as this pivotal change in world history. What I really see it is as accelerating a lot of the trends that already existed and many of the problematic trends. So, for example, we had a problem with debt rising much too quickly. It's going to rise even more quickly. We had a problem with unbalanced consumption in China. The data already suggests that consumption will be even more unbalanced. We had a problem with rising income inequality, and the data in China, and I think abroad too, shows that the wealthy have done reasonably well out of COVID-19, and the poorer you are, the worse it's affected you. So all of these trends that we discuss in our book and all of the problems that arise out of them, I really see as having been accelerated by COVID-19. So I think obviously we would have put more focus specifically on the impact of COVID-19 in the acceleration of this process had we written this book later. But basically, I think the underlying arguments are pretty much unchanged.
Yeah. Marty, what do you think about the angle on COVID? Would you expect him to write it?
I bore more or less in my own columns on the crisis, and of course by now I've written many, have taken basically the same view. It looks at the moment as though it's largely an accelerator. It's and there are a few other trends it's clearly accelerated. I think it's accelerated the whatever it is, war between the US and China, indeed the West and China, for a number of reasons, probably the most important of which is the West need, and the US need in particular, to blame somebody for the disaster. And China is a pretty convenient scapegoat, but I think it's made that worse. Generally, it's made international relations worse. More broadly, created a lot of tension. I think that's pretty clear. It's, and this is really quite important, if you consider that the essential goal of macro policy since the crisis has been to sustain demand by any means necessary, and above all through hyper easy monetary policy, supported to some extent by fiscal policy. Obviously, COVID-19 has almost transformed that in scale. I mean, we are seeing the biggest monetary and fiscal expansions in any period in Western history, barring the two world wars. So this is, again, a huge accelerator. We're seeing a technology accelerator, which I think is very important. Finally, I could go into others, which is the shift, which is very noticeable in the work of people like me and many others, towards working online, virtual sessions like this one, moving away, as it were, from physical movement to virtual movement. I think that's probably permanent. And it's another way in which, by and large, educated people who do jobs which allow them to work in the virtual realm, in the cyber realm, are favored. The assets, of course, they own, but the richest are favored by the monetary policies as well, while most relatively worse off people work in face-to-face service activities, enormous numbers in the West, increasingly in China. And of course, those face-to-face activities have been massively disrupted, and some of them, I think, will never return. I think the high streets of the West will be permanently changed. So in those three respects too, I think this looks like a powerful accelerator. I think we've lived 5 years in 5 months in terms of the movement on these dimensions. Now, perhaps I should talk a little bit about the book and then go into the wider field. So I'm broadly sympathetic, and I have been for many, many years, to this analysis. So I'm not the ideal interlocutor for Michael. It should be somebody who thinks everything he thinks is wrong. I don't. I've been, even before the global financial crisis, I was focusing very heavily on global imbalances, the role of the US as it were, the consumer of last resort in the world system, as the issuer of the only world money, the counterparts of that in financial excess, the need to get American households to borrow so much, which I wrote about a lot in 2005, 6, 7. So the basic analysis I shared with, and I think Michael has added one absolutely crucial element to that understanding, which is that underlying these imbalances have been imbalances in domestic savings, and in particular income accruing to people at the top of the income distribution, and companies even more so, corporate profits. And the result has been, the way I would put it, chronic excess savings in a number of very important countries, which have had to be mopped up elsewhere in a world economy that seems to lack adequate investment opportunities. So that fits in with Larry Summers' subsequent development of the secular stagnation thesis, which is, I think, another way of putting similar things. Now, perhaps the most important question to ask, since you're in China, given my obviously strong agreement with the board framework, is, okay, your book focuses on the savings imbalances and trade wars, but the trade surplus of China has diminished very significantly since the crisis, the financial crisis. The global imbalances have actually diminished quite substantially too. So why is this analysis not now pretty out of date? Of course, Germany is a nuisance. I agree with you in the European context, but it's really rather a small country. It's not capable of causing the mayhem that was caused before the global financial crisis by the rising Chinese surpluses. Isn't this story now a story about the past?
Well, yes and no. First off, I think one of the responses to COVID-19 in China, and I hope not so much in the rest of the world, has been really to focus on supply side measures rather than demand side measures. So one of the consequences, which I've been writing about for a while, is that there's really three ways this can resolve itself. So if you keep pushing on the supply side, you can either stop and allow companies to go bankrupt and unemployment to soar, and that resolves the domestic imbalance, but in a very bad way. Or you can allow the trade surplus to soar, and in fact, that's what's been happening. In the first quarter, the trade surplus was pretty low. It was about 0.4%. China actually ran a current account deficit of about 0.8%. I don't know what the current account data is for the second quarter yet, but the trade surplus in the second quarter rose to about 4.4%, which is a pretty worrying number. And we're going to watch and see how that continues over the rest of the year. But that's one of the way of resolving the chronic underconsumption, which is driven, as you and I have discussed many times, by the low household income share of GDP in China. The third way you can resolve it is if consumption isn't going to do the trick of absorbing everything that China produces, And if business investment isn't going to do the trick, because business investment is driven as much as anything else by exports and household consumption, then that really only leaves, aside from a surging trade surplus, a significant increase in public sector investment in infrastructure. And as you and I have discussed many times, that's become a real big problem for China. China, I would argue, long ago reached the point at which it was sort of institutionally capable of absorbing additional infrastructure productively. And as a result, much of the new infrastructure spending really results in debt rising much faster than any measure, any real measure of debt servicing capacities. Or to put it differently, it means more debt for the country, a greater debt burden for the country. In fact, this is one of the points we tried to make in the book, the role of debt in the current account. Because when you increase debt, and this is not just in China, this is anywhere, the debt either goes to increase investment or to increase consumption by definition. And if it increases investment, then of course, when you have that savings investment gap, investment goes up and you narrow the gap. If it goes to increase consumption, then savings comes down and again, you narrow the gap. So I really see the current account surplus as sort of intermediating the amount of debt required in China to achieve whatever its GDP growth targets are. So it's true that China's current account surplus started to come down quite significantly, although last year it started to pick up again, and I expect this year it'll pick up again. But the point is that it's come down as a function of the increase in debt, and should China ever try to bring debt under control, then once again, things have to balance. And the only two ways, if you stop debt from growing, the only two ways China really can balance in the short term is either with a rise in unemployment, which they don't want, or a rise in the current account surplus, or a rise in the trade surplus, which means the rest of the world will once again have to absorb the domestic demand deficiency. So I think that's really where we stand. The problem hasn't been really resolved. It's been the global consequence of the problem has been resolved by an unsustainable increase in domestic debt. What happens when you stop? Then once again, you have to deal with the problem of underconsumption domestically.
Well, let's just go into two follow-up questions on that before perhaps we should do what you're asked and look a little bit at Germany and Europe. So one answer would be, okay, the Chinese accumulate debt. The debt is owned by Chinese, the debtors are Chinese. If the worst comes to the worst, in some very, very distant future, a lot of Chinese people default on a lot of Chinese people. They realize they weren't as rich as they thought they were. This is basically just a substitute for taxation. And that's essentially, I would argue what's been happening in Japan, and it is worth noting they've continued to go on accumulating debt, and now predominantly in the public sector for 30 years after their crisis. Their growth is underlying growth is much lower than China. So what on earth is the problem here? People can go on accumulating debt on oneself. And another example, Italy is sitting on a lot of debt, almost all of which you didn't discuss in the book, was actually contracted in the 80s and 90s. And periodically it shocks upwards. About 2/3 of that debt is owned by Italians. The reason they owed all that debt is in the 80s and 90s, the Italians didn't pay any tax. Essentially, they did after they joined the Eurozone, not so much noted. And so they lent money to the government instead. The government borrowed, and at some point, but no doubt, at some point, somehow the government will default, and that's just the tax coming due. And the reason this is a relevant comparison is that the alternative for the Chinese all along would have been for the Chinese to tax the recipients of capital income and the high earners in China and transfer the money to households. Millions of ways of doing this. the debt is just an alternative way of doing this. At the end, there will be, as I said, defaults, one way or another. And what's the problem here?
That's, I think, in some ways the key question. If we were living in a Miller and Modigliani world, it wouldn't be a problem. A default is simply a transfer and everything continues exactly as it used to. The problem is that the way you resolve debt, I mean, there's basically two types of debt. There's debt that's self-liquidating. You borrow money and you invest it in something that creates the debt servicing capacity. And so that's one kind of debt. The problem that we have here in China is that the only way the government can resolve the debt, the only way governments can ever resolve their debt burdens is by allocating the cost to some sectors of the economy. So defaulting is just one way of allocating the cost to the creditors. You can inflate it away, in which case you allocate the cost to whoever is long monetary assets. So for example, the household sector. You can use financial repression, which is what China did in the first decade of the century, which also allocates the cost of the household sector. You can do what Ceausescu did in the 80s and squeeze the hell out of the workers. You can expropriate the rich. There's lots of different ways. You're absolutely right. What I would argue, though, is that when there is significant uncertainty about how the government will end up allocating the costs of the debt, then that changes behavior, and you'll recognize this as the classic financial distress argument in corporate finance theory. In corporate finance theory, we say when the probability of bankruptcy rises enough, all of the agents, all of the stakeholders in a company change their behavior. Creditors raise their borrowing costs or their lending costs. Employees seek employment elsewhere. Managers change their behaviors. Competitors change their behaviors. Clients, suppliers, everyone changes their behavior to protect themselves from the possibility of a bankruptcy. And the change in behavior always results in slower growth and an increasingly fragile balance sheet, which is why it tends to be highly self-reinforcing. What I would argue is, and that I think I've talked to you about my next planned book, Martin, but I really want to write a book about debt. And I would argue that there's an analog to that in macroeconomics, and that is that when debt levels rise to the point where there is significant uncertainty about how the debt servicing costs are going to be allocated. You mentioned, for example, if you write down the debt, it turns out that Chinese are not as rich as they thought they were, and that's absolutely correct because much of the increase in wealth in China has been of the form of capitalizing expenses. And once you recognize that those are expenses, not investments, somebody has to lose money. So the question always becomes who? Who absorbs the cost? Now, ideally, as you said, it should be local governments and perhaps local elites. But we've known that since 2007, at least 2007, then Premier Wen Jiabao's speech of that year about rebalancing. And I think it's not a coincidence that within months after that speech, we saw the first recognition or the first articles in the Chinese press about the so-called vested interests. The opposition to the rebalancing programs or rebalancing policies proposed under Wen Jiabao and Hu Jintao. And in fact, China didn't rebalance. Over the next 5 years, it actually got worse. And the problem of vested interests got worse. And I would say that that really is the problem, and that is that when you decide that we're going to resolve this debt problem by the allocation of the debt servicing costs, you get tremendous resistance. What should happen is rich people should take their money out of the country. Businesses should shorten their time horizons or even disinvest, both things that we're seeing in China. Workers should unionize and militantly now. I don't know if we'll ever see that in China, but certainly workers are not going to want to bear the brunt of the cost of the adjustment, and they shouldn't, because that'll make the imbalances worse. The middle class, in principle, will be worried about the currency and will start taking money out of the banks, et cetera, et cetera. So I would argue that in a Miller and Modigliani world, the answer is quite straightforward. Write down the damn debt and just keep on doing stuff. But in reality, it's very, very difficult to do that because writing it down means writing it down specifically against certain sectors. farmers, it tends to be the politically most vulnerable. But in the case of China, that makes the imbalances worse, not better. So it's not quite so easy. Now, in a country like Japan, as you mentioned, they never really wrote down the debt. They just kept it going. And I would say, yeah, that is one of the alternatives. But of course, Japan used to be 17% of the world, and today it's around 7%, which had anyone predicted that back in 1991, he would have been shipped off to a lunatic asylum. It seemed inconceivable. But I would argue that that's sort of what the historical precedents suggest. When you have too much debt, and I want to try to define what too much debt is in my book, because that's also a difficult thing to get your arms around. But when you're perceived as having too much debt, you tend to resolve it in the form of a debt crisis, which I think is unlikely in the case of China, lost decades of stagnation, which I think is likely, or some rapid resolution of the debt, which tends to be politically very, very contentious and quite difficult to pull off. So it is a problem. It can't simply be resolved by writing it down. It has to be written down against highly resistant economic sectors.
Yeah, but I mean, in a way, that's quite a puzzle, because one would have thought the one advantage of the Chinese type system, particularly the current one under Xi, is that you can make the tough decisions which allocate losses. If you look at the history of communist China, they've allocated some pretty impressive losses in between 1949 and 1978, and even after they've allocated these losses, everybody is going to be spectacularly much richer than they were at that time. You're basically making a political, not an economic judgment. And it's a very peculiar political judgment, because what I'm told by all my Chinese friends is the great advantage of having our system is we can make decisions, unlike you useless Westerners. And you're suggesting that, in fact, which is a political judgment, that actually they can't.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, and this is why I've always had a slightly different view of the centralizing tendency of Xi Jinping than many other people have, because it was under Hu Jintao that they tried to begin this process, and they failed miserably. In fact, as I said, the imbalances got worse after they recognized the need to reverse them. And when you look back at the historical precedents for a country having to go through such a massive transformation, particularly a transformation of wealth, the precedents are pretty ugly. There were some papers that Acemoglu and Robinson did at the beginning of the last decade, in which they looked at some of these cases, and then their conclusion I thought intuitively very appealing, but I thought it was very interesting. What they argued was that countries that have to go through this type of transformation tend to have political crises, but there are exceptions. And the exceptions they pointed to were very, very robust democracies. And the classic case could be the United States in the 1930s, pretty substantial redistribution of wealth. We almost had a political crisis, but we didn't. And then the other extreme would be highly centralized autocracies. And there, the case they use is very intriguing, because it was China in the 1980s. The transformations that China went through, remember, were ferociously opposed by the Communist Party elite. But at the time, China was highly centralized. The PLA was very loyal to Deng Xiaoping, and he was able to push it through, not without great difficulty. And perhaps you might even argue they came close to a political crisis, but they were able to push it through. Now, one of the things that Deng Xiaoping argued, and I think most of us would find it intuitively appealing, is that in a large country like China, you can't really have such a heavy centralization of the economic policy-making process. So he began a process of decentralizing the policy making, and perhaps it's because of my many years on Wall Street, but I always look at the banking system. And you'll remember in the 1990s, as late as the 1990s, almost all lending in China was done by Beijing-based institutions, more than 90%. In the 80s, it was 100%. But by now, probably less than 50% of all credit allocation is done by Beijing-based institutions, and more than 50 by local institutions, local and provincial banks. And for me, that's a measure of the amount of decentralization that took place. Now, if you believe in the Acemoglu-Robinson argument, then you would say that creates a really big problem. If you're advising Xi Jinping in 2012, your advice should be, you've got this very difficult transformation that has to take place, a major reallocation of wealth domestically. You are not a pure democracy, and you are not a highly centralized autocracy anymore. You've got to become one or the other. Now, obviously, becoming a democracy very quickly was never in the cards. So in a way, you could argue that Xi Jinping recognized the need to re-centralize power if he was going to force through these adjustments. Now, here we are 8 years later. Are we closer to forcing through these adjustments? I don't know, and none of us really know. There are 50 to 60 people in China who really understand the state of politics, and obviously I'm not one of them. But I would say that so far it's proven very difficult to manage these transfers. And when you speak to Chinese, they acknowledge that, of course, China is an autocratic system, but that doesn't mean that the leaders do whatever they want. There is significant power spread out through China, and the evidence, of course, is the whole vested interest debate. So, yeah, you're right. Maybe China can pull it off. It's been trying, and it hasn't been successful yet. But in principle, they could simply say, we're taking your money, and if you don't like it, you're going to jail. But that may not be so easy.
Well, we will see on that. Let's, and we can go on forever. I've got lots to say on Japan. I disagree with your view a bit on that. But let's go to the trade war part of it, because that's obviously a very important and topical part of your argument. And indeed, I have also written in sundry books over the years that the obvious Chinese solution is the vent for surplus model, which is goes back to the underconsumption ideas which are in your book going back to the late 19th century, and the idea of which links up, of course, with Lenin's theory of imperialism, what imperialism was about, getting over foreign resources and foreign markets. So far, the main counterpart, consistent counterpart of Chinese surplus has tended to be American deficits. It's pretty clear that one thing that the American body politic agrees on, pretty clear from the recent statements from the Biden camp, is that that's not going to be allowed to happen again. So if China goes back into surplus mode, which is, I think, perfectly plausible, if they don't want to continue to do a lot of very wasteful investment, they've got to find somebody else. And they have to do so while the West is becoming increasingly unfriendly, and they're the biggest markets in aggregate scale outside China. So where, in your view, does the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, Chinese lending to emerging and developing countries more broadly, a lot of which, of course, is going bad, very bad now. Where does that fit in what you might call a new form of, very similar to late 19th century European imperialism? How do you see that in the context of your model?
Well, a quick word on BRI. I think you're absolutely right. Things have gone bad. And I would say 3 years ago, Venezuela really shocked, certainly among my former students that are involved in sort of the BRI financing. That came as a terrible shock. And I think what we're now seeing is that, we still talk a great deal about BRI. It's in the Chinese constitution. It's a flagship program of Xi Jinping. So we're not going to stop talking about it, but the funding into BRI, certainly China would like to do less and less of that because, as you know, making loans are quite easy. getting the loans back is much more difficult. And that's always been the problem, particularly when you're lending to countries that nobody else wants to lend to. So I don't think BRI is going to be the solution. But the way we think about this in our book is that we don't really look at the bilateral trade accounts, because I'm not sure bilateral trade tells us anything very useful here. But let's assume that everybody is in balance, and then for whatever reason, China has $100 of surplus, whether it's surplus savings or surplus production, it's the same thing, and it invests that $100 in the US. Then what that tells us is China is going to run a current account surplus of $100. And the US is going to run a current account deficit of $100. It doesn't say that the trade, the surplus and deficit must be with each other. All it says is that China's global account is going to be in surplus and the US global account is going to be in deficit. And that's why I was always extremely critical of Navarro, or I don't know, maybe he's Ron Vara, whatever his name is, his approach to trade, because I argued that if the US puts tariffs on Chinese goods, but there is no change in the direction of the flow of capital, then what that means is that the US deficit with China should contract, the Chinese surplus with the US should contract, but the US deficit with the rest of the world should expand, and the Chinese surplus with the rest of the world should expand. And that seems to be exactly what's happened. The US deficit with China has contracted, but not with the world. And I would argue that, yeah, that's obvious. If what's driving the imbalances is the surplus savings, then tariffs on trade aren't really going to make much of a difference. They'll rearrange the bilateral imbalances, but they won't really change the imbalances. And I think that's the key there. I think that's why we haven't really seen much improvement, and why all of this talk about tariffs, et cetera, I think this is all political nonsense. I don't think it makes a lot of economic sense.
Yeah, well, obviously I agree with that. The focus on bilateral trade is completely irrelevant. And ultimately, of course, you could imagine other macro solutions. The US could, in fact, decide to accumulate claims in aggregate on other countries as fast as other countries are accumulating claims on it. So running a net zero capital position, and presumably also, therefore, a net zero current account. Of course, it would end up then, as indeed to some significant degree it has, as a country that borrows cheap, but these are safe assets, and acquires risky foreign assets. But actually, that's a transaction that generally has worked out quite well for the US. Maybe it should do it on an even bigger scale.
Possibly, but if the US were to say buy more Chinese assets, more Chinese government bonds, more Japanese government bonds, more European government bonds, the question then becomes, does that change the capital flows in those other countries? And if it simply causes reserves to rise, and which means that they're recycled back into the US, my worry there we would see ourselves in this really weird process in which the US exports dollars to Japan to buy Japanese government bonds. Japan exports them back to the US to buy US government bonds. And you can't really get ahead of that. Because if the problem is really underconsumption or excess savings, those savings have to go somewhere. So what the US could do, in theory, is play a game of chicken, where we'll buy your stuff if you buy our stuff until somebody blows up. But obviously I don't think that would be the best solution. I think the solution has to be something else, because there really isn't a problem with trade. There isn't a problem with offshoring even. The way I think about it is, if an American company closed down its manufacturing plants in the US and moved them to China because China is more efficient, then there's no problem with that, because the Chinese will then get paid more money and they will consume more and they will import more. And directly or indirectly, those imports will come from the US. So the US loses, some business and replaces it with more efficient business, and everyone's better off. That's how trade is supposed to work. The reason it's not working, in my opinion, is not because of offshoring. It's because when a US manufacturer moves to China or Germany or Japan, the problem there is that the workers are getting paid much less as a share of their productivity than they are in the US. So immediately global consumption drops. To me, that's the problem. Until you can resolve that problem, then we can shift imbalances around. And as I say, it becomes a game of chicken. But I'm not sure that that's really a solution. I think that's just shifting the imbalances around.
There is a puzzle with this sort of story, because basically what you're saying is there's been a big shift of income away from workers to capital. So return on capital must have been rising at some level worldwide. And it may be not necessarily in the places where the savings have been accumulated, but somewhere. And if the return on capital has been rising worldwide, there should be enormous investment opportunities worldwide, somewhere. And therefore your underconsumption or excess savings story shouldn't have occurred, because somewhere in the world, maybe other developing and emerging countries with good demographics, maybe Africa, India, so should have been investing like mad and absorbing this excess savings in this world where the one thing that is clear is that capital is doing great. This is not like the 70s where profits collapsed. So why hasn't this happened?
Well, I would distinguish between two types of economies. One type of economy, which was probably most of the world 100 years ago, 200 years ago, but today is mostly developing countries, are economies in which there are high investment needs and insufficient domestic capital to meet those needs. Europe and Japan after World War II, for example, income was destroyed, investment needs were very high, insufficient capital to meet the investment needs. In that case, anything that raises the savings rate increases investment because there is a demand for investment. But I would say that in the US and in most advanced economies today, what really drives investment is not the availability of savings. We have plenty of savings. American companies, European companies before COVID-19 were sitting on huge piles of cash and didn't know what to do with it. They couldn't invest it, so they bought back stock or other things like that, which of course are not investment. So what really drives their investment needs? I would say ultimately what drives it is consumption. If consumption is growing quickly, they will invest to service that growth in consumption, and if it isn't, it isn't. So that's just a long way of saying that the developed economies, Europe, the US, Japan, et cetera, don't really need these savings, right? They're not going to, you can lower interest rates as much as you want, but if you lower interest rates effectively by reducing consumption growth, then you're not going to see the corresponding increase in savings. Where will you see an increase in savings and investment? If those savings flow to developing countries. And maybe we need better mechanisms for doing that. In the 19th century, a lot of excess savings from England flowed to developing countries, including the US. But today the problem is, and some people call it a big paradox, is most international capital, I think over 90% of it, flows to the US and other advanced economies, where I would argue that the savings basically are unnecessary because there's no savings constraint on investment. Now, this could change, and I know you've written about this too. The big advantage, ironically, that the US and Europe have over China is that our infrastructure is terrible. So we could certainly use that to rebuild our infrastructure. But again, that becomes a political problem. For some reason, we refuse to do it. But that would be one place where we could really use the excess savings. But until then, I'm afraid that the correct use, which is to divert it into developing countries, is something that savers just don't want to do because of the perceived risks, real risks.
Can I just chip in a question about my own country?
Yeah, I was going to come to that. So you go and ask about Germany. I was
Right.
just going to ask about
I
Germany.
couldn't hold it. I had to come out with this.
Right, absolutely.
Michael is writing, Germans who have been such avid exporters of financial capital over the past 2 decades are mostly almost uniquely bad at investing abroad. And then you give the numbers, and it's rather shocking to a German like myself. And you made an article about this. The headline was, Germany's surplus is a product of domestic weakness. What's wrong with my country?
Well, I think you should ask Martin, because basically I stole all of his arguments. But what I would argue is that in the case of Germany, Germany achieved import competitiveness. There's two ways to become more competitive internationally. One way is to increase the productivity of workers, but the other, much easier way, is to reduce the share that's paid to workers. And I would argue that basically the Hartz reforms in 2003, 2004, 2005, their effect was to reduce the share of GDP retained by households, particularly workers, and to increase the share of GDP retained by business. Profits soared during that period, and as it should. If you reduce wages, presumably profits go up. So I would argue that what happened in Germany was simply a large transfer of income from households to businesses, which meant a sharp reduction in consumption, because of course businesses don't consume. And so the result was Germany produced far more than it could absorb domestically. And in classic trade theory, countries don't run persistent trade imbalances, with very few, very specialized exceptions. Normally, if you're very efficient at producing, your reward is you get to import more. The reward isn't a trade surplus. And I would argue persistent trade surpluses, persistent trade deficits, are generally caused by distortions in the distribution of income, because in classic trade theory, if it's any other reason, it automatically adjusts. And so I would say the problem in Germany is that you're not exporting massive amounts because you are particularly efficient at producing stuff. You're exporting massive amounts because you're incapable of absorbing them domestically, and you need the external accounts to resolve both the savings imbalance and the production imbalance. But like I said, I stole most of that from Martin, so maybe I'll let him.
I just add two comments, which I think are interesting. First, I disagree with Michael on one quite important point. It's not a profound disagreement, but I think there is an aspect in which Germany is astonishingly competitive. And the way I think of this is this: it actually operates very, very effectively with the macroeconomics of a small open economy. Though it's not a small economy, obviously. It's not a huge one, but it's a pretty big one. What do I mean by that? In most countries, UK, for example, or France, a country like that, if you, for whatever reason, domestic demand falls because either fiscal policy is tightened dramatically, or in this case, income shifts from people who do spend to people who don't, the normal consequence is a very prolonged recession, because domestic demand largely is the principal determinant of domestic output, and the external sector is not robust enough to expand the externally oriented sector, either import substitution and or exports at the rate to offset the weakness in domestic demand is that as a consequence of what we described. Now, we did see a bit of that in Germany, just that, in the first decade of the 2000s, after the fiscal policy was tightened and the labor market weakness Michael described emerged. But the remarkable thing, I think, was that Germany's export sector, particularly, was able to expand supply and find demand at pretty constant prices which were actually very profitable. Profit shares were high on an enormous scale. And Germany re-emerged, as Jörg will very remember, as the export Weltmeister. Briefly, I think China overtook it later. And the point I would make is that not only is there a very high elasticity of supply of exportables, which is obvious, we know that, but the world demand for German exportables seems to be pretty close to perfectly elastic. And certainly far more elastic than for most other significant developed countries. And Japan, for example, is actually an interesting counterexample because they haven't done this. And so they've had to rely on the fiscal balance, the fiscal deficit to support demand. They haven't been able to rely on the external sector to support demand. So what makes Germany, I think, unique is it can rely on the external sector to generate demand, even during immediately after a big world recession. And so I think Germany has an astoundingly competitive export sector, which is exactly what you think. It operates like a small open economy. It operates like Korea. What Korea looks like this too. Now, the problem with that policy is, of course, it means by definition that you, as Jörg pointed out, that you accumulate very large claims on the rest of the world. Germany has been a huge exporter of savings. Roughly a third of gross savings have been exported abroad, and the return has been utterly miserable. And that gives me my other point, which I think is also important about Germany, which might be happening. Maybe the COVID-19 crisis is bringing about a bit of a revolution in German policy. Germany has, of course, running the most aggressive fiscal policy in Europe by far. In fact, possibly the most aggressive fiscal policy in response to this crisis anywhere. It's in an excellent fiscal position to do so. Its debt was relatively low. Its deficit was zero. And this was eminently sensible and very helpful. But it is possible, it seems to me, that and this is my optimistic picture, having done this, Germany might be saying to itself, well, this is quite nice, we can do that. And maybe we can actually rebuild all the infrastructure and run a modest deficit, fiscal deficit, 3% of GDP, 4% of GDP, which Germany can easily afford. So it has super negative real interest rates on its government debt. There's no debt problem at all. The world is paying Germany to borrow. And if Germany does that, and in addition, as Merkel has decided, helps Europe to spend more, then some of the big macro imbalances of the Eurozone will disappear, and it will look both economically and economically more buoyant from a demand point of view, and the imbalances within the Eurozone will also tend to diminish. So one of the few pieces of optimism I feel at the moment is that the episode of the Schwarze Null, the absolute zero deficit, whatever happens, which of course it was always admitted could be overridden in an emergency. Maybe the emergency will be regarded a bit more broadly, and the shift we're seeing in German policy now will be a bit more long-lasting. Now, that's a mild optimism. But I think it is something that could happen. So those are my 2 points about Germany. And I think at this stage, unless Jörg wants to come in back or Michael wants to come back, we should look at some of these questions we've received. What do you feel?
Well, actually, Jacob is looking at them and was signaling there are some good ones. So here we go.
Our first question comes from a good friend of the chamber, Martin Reiser, director of the World Bank here in China. Michael, how do you explain the persistently high savings rate in China? And what could government policy do about this? And would this necessarily entail a transitionary recession?
The argument I've made for a high savings rate and a persistently high savings rate in China and in countries like Germany and Japan, countries that are perceived as having high savings rate, is pretty straightforward. What I argue is that there are many ways you can divide up an economy. So one way of dividing up an economy is to divide it into four groups: ordinary households, rich households, businesses, and governments. And each of those have completely different propensities to consume out of income. Ordinary households consume most of their income. Rich households consume very little of their income. Businesses, of course, consume zero. And governments also consume very little on behalf of households. So when you transfer income within those groups, you affect the overall savings rate in the country. And what happened in China is that the household share of GDP declined really dramatically from in the 70s, in the 1980s. That sounds confusing, but more than 70% in the 1980s to it bottomed out at around 50% of 4 or 5 years ago, and it's still quite low. So that means that households retain a smaller share of GDP and businesses and governments retain a much larger share. And within the household share, something else happened. There was a major transfer of income from ordinary households to the rich. We saw a huge increase in income inequality. So in China, you had sort of this double whammy. On the one hand, households retained a smaller and smaller share of GDP. And on the other hand, within households, the rich retained a larger and larger share. So as a result, the component of income that went to the high consuming part of the economy contracted very dramatically over that period until around 2011, 2012, where now it's slowly starting to creep up. And you see the almost immediate impact on consumption. The consumption share of GDP has come down a lot. There have been a lot of attempts to boost consumption in China, but most of those attempts don't make sense because they don't address the real problem, which is an income distribution problem. So for example, recently we've been hearing that the problem in consumption is that the shopping malls close too early, or that there are logistical problems, or that it's difficult to buy stuff. We have to make it easier to buy stuff for Chinese, and that's all nonsense. China actually has one of the most efficient retail distributions in the world. The reason the Chinese aren't consuming is not because it's too difficult to consume. This is not the Soviet Union in the 1960s. The reason they're not consuming is they don't have the income to consume. They're consuming as much as they can out of income. And if you want the consumption share to go up, it's just an arithmetic problem. Either household debt must go up, which it did for many years, and now it's at such high levels that it's actually declining, or household income, the household income share of GDP must go up. And that's it. There are no other possibilities. So I would argue that until we see these direct or indirect transfers from local governments, maybe from the rich, although I'm pessimistic, towards ordinary households, it's going to be very hard to raise the household income share. There are also demographic issues, et cetera, which I haven't got into because I think they're much less important than the distributional issue.
Martin, you want to chip in?
Yeah, well, I mean, two things, neither of which I'm an expert, but are quite interesting. China seems to me to have a very undeveloped fiscal system. And as it gets richer, it needs to do something about that. In principle, with a better fiscal system, which means obviously ability of functioning progressive income tax and corporation taxes, it should be able to do more redistribution. And also, and this leads to my second thing, while I agree very strongly with Michael's overall perception, the data I've seen show still that households in China do save quite a lot. It's not the bulk of savings in the country which comes elsewhere, and I presume a lot of that household saving is of relatively wealthy households. I think that sounds fairly plausible, but it wouldn't seem to me very surprising if with the development, and we've seen this in quite a number of other countries, Britain and America, when they developed, if you generate risk sharing through welfare programs of various kinds, precautionary savings in the household sector might diminish a bit and the consumption rate might rise somewhat closer to income. I don't think that's, I agree completely with Michael, that's in Chinese context relatively marginal, but it's an issue. One final point worth adding, which relates to the Japanese case. Japan is sort of a little like China. Its household income share is much higher than in China, but it's very low by the standards of many developed countries, particularly the US. And so corporate shares and wealthy people but basically corporate shares of profit shares are very high, and savings shares are correspondingly very high. And the corporate sector has failed to absorb those savings for a very, very long time. So it would have been perfectly possible for Michael to include Japan in his story, because it's very like, at a macro level, it's incredibly like Germany, with one significant difference, which I've already mentioned, which is the external sector doesn't counterbalance the domestic excess savings. It's predominantly the government sector, the government deficits, that counterbalances the domestic savings. So Japanese people, ultimately through the corporate sector, are accumulating claims on their government, rather than, as in Germany, accumulating claims on foreign governments. It's a very interesting question, which of these is the more foolish policy. I suppose it depends a bit on the quality of the foreign government's liabilities, which we've already discussed. So those are a couple of comments, or a few comments, on this very important discussion. And if somebody wants to come back on that, we can go on to the next question.
Well, I would like to add one thing, Martin. You and Brad Setzer have done really great work on this. And the point that I would make is that improving the social safety net, to me, is just another way of transferring wealth to the household sector. So
of course,
I could give you $100, or I could promise you that if you get sick, you'll get $100. Either way, the savings rate changes.
yeah, I agree completely.
Our next question, interesting analysis on Germany with its persistent trade surplus. How do you view the argument that Germany's inclusion in the Eurozone essentially subsidizes German exports? And how would you incorporate that into your own analysis? And we'll direct this first to Martin, and then see if Michael has anything to contribute.
Well, that fits in the argument that I made in my book. My last book on the global crisis, which Michael was kind enough to quite like. I think this is a very interesting point, and I have written a bit about this. So I talked about the difference between Germany and Japan, and the remarkable ability of the German economy to operate like a small open economy with what seems like highly competitive exports, whatever happens, and because the prices don't change very much, even when surpluses accumulate, and I'll come to this in a second, and Germany produces things the world really wants. They can do macro balance through the external account, which is, to me, the characteristic of small open economy macro. At the opposite end is the US or China. Trying to do macro balance through the current account for economies of this scale is insane, because it creates such huge global problems, which is, in a way, the core part of Michael's analysis. Now, the interesting question is, and I have written about this, if we were in 2010, say, after the world financial crisis, and we had the ERM, but not the single currency, what would have happened? And my argument was, well, we know damn well what would have happened. There will be a massive flight of capital from over-indebted Italy, Spain, Germany, Greece, Portugal, Central and Eastern Europe, Ireland, and it would all have poured into D-Mark. Of course it would. And at some point, we know what would have happened. The Bundesbank would have said, after cutting interest rates like crazy, but they would have already been very, very low, because interest rates were fairly low at that period, I think because of global excess savings, the Bundesbank would say, well, that's enough of that. We're not going to support your currencies. You're going to devalue. And there would have been a huge currency adjustment. And I think it would have been huge. And that's sort of what the Japanese have always feared, that if they ever get their position in the current account gets too strong, the yen will be forced upwards massively. And since Japanese exporters know that's going to happen to them, investing massively in domestic production for export in Japan is a very risky thing for businesses to do, because periodically the yen will go through the roof and kill your profitability. It's far better to put all your factories around the world. And that's what the Japanese did. And I think that's an enormous part of, to me, that's a more important part of the slowdown in growth in Japan than the debt, which actually I think is a consequence. But we don't need to go into that. This is a very, very important part. In Germany, that couldn't happen. So its export competitiveness remained essentially unchanged. The adjustment process through capital flows and monetary adjustments within the single currency did not work at all in the way that a gold standard system like this was supposed to work, which would have been to generate excess demand in Germany as money poured into Germany, accumulated in the reserves of German banks, led to enormous credit growth by German banks in Germany, and a huge credit boom and inflation in Germany. That's the classic specie flow mechanism in the modern guise, as described by David Hume in the very first macro model ever produced in the middle of the 18th century. It didn't happen at all. So Germany's competitiveness was sustained. Germany's economy didn't have to adjust in any big way. Fiscal policy remained the same. Germany remained very competitive, and its trading partners went into deep recessions. Because they moved into deep recessions and adjusted their savings investment balances very, very painfully in the process, the Eurozone as a whole moved into balance and then into massive surplus, which was basically the German surplus shifted abroad. And that was possible too, because the Eurozone consists of this very strong, externally competitive economy and one or two others like the Netherlands, and lots of weak ones. So the Eurozone real exchange rate is clearly also significantly less overvalued, less highly valued, if you like, than it would be if it were the D-mark. So to summarize this, I've just collapsed this analysis. I think the macro model Germany has been able to run since 2008 would probably have been unsustainable if the D-mark still existed, because to run that without fiscal deficits, I'm absolutely convinced, just think this through, what would have happened in that model? The Bundesbank would have been driven to do what the Swiss central bank did, which is target exchange rates, however much they disliked it, and run negative rates, really negative rates. And in that situation, it would have been better for them to run large fiscal deficits, as the Japanese have done. So in essence, what I wrote in a column, which I still is one of them I'm most proud of, is that the Eurozone helped Germany not become Japan. This is the quickest analysis I can give. And so the Eurozone is very, very good for Germany, in my view. And I think intelligent Germans, economists, there are some, I'm teasing, understand this.
Of course, Martin is 100% right. And the only thing that I would slightly disagree with is that it is good for Germany as an exporting manufacturing nation,
but
not necessarily good for Germany. Yeah, not necessarily.
It's a class war again.
Exactly. So I just
want to very good for German companies, and therefore for Jürgen,
exactly. And I want to go through the mechanism.
German households consume much less
than they should.
Of Germany would justify, and German households are much less rich than you would given the productivity level of their country.
Absolutely. And I want to, for those who still don't see the balances, I want to maybe try to explain how it might have worked otherwise. If Germany had been a separate country and it had had such a huge surplus, the Deutschmark would have risen without the baggage of Europe. And as the Deutschmark rises, the way I think about that is as the currency goes up, you see basically a transfer of wealth from net exporters to net importers. And the exporters are the manufacturing sector. Households are all net importers. So basically, households get richer. Their share of GDP goes up. And as their share of GDP goes up, their consumption goes up, and you move the country back into rough balance. The problem that I see in Germany is that Germans are about 80% as productive as Americans per person, but they get paid only 60% of the wages. They're about 125% as productive as English workers, but they get paid only 100% of the wages. That's the problem. German competitiveness is based on relatively low wages, and Europe prevents the wages from rising.
I'm going to tell my boss about my next salary.
Our next question comes from Yanni Henoinen. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong. All right, in the past few years, it seems increasingly evident that China is becoming more and more nationalistic and kind of closing up. So A, do you think this is the case? But then following from that, can the Chinese economy really survive a decoupling from a globalized economy? And shouldn't China be doing more in an open and globalized economy? Shouldn't China be a winner in a more open and globalized economy and thus defend it more fiercely?
Well, that's a question I get asked a lot. Why are the Chinese becoming so nasty? And my argument is that, yes, the Chinese are becoming nastier, but let's be honest, so are the Americans, so are the Brits, so are the Hungarians, so are the Brazilians, so are the Indians. I think I wrote about this in my 2013 book, is that as we go through this process of what Danny Roderick might call a reversal of this globalization process, historically, it's always been accompanied by rising geopolitical tensions, by anti-foreign feeling, anti-immigrant feeling. And so I had argued, and I think Martin's made similar arguments, that it's not really surprising. And I think it's a mistake to focus only on China or only on Trump or only on Brexit. I think this is really a global problem. And I always say, I think it's going to get worse before it gets better.
The only point I'd add, which is obvious, it obviously links also with, and I think that comes out very, very well from their book, actually, particularly the historical chapters, the geopolitics of all this. That along with shifting global balances and shifting competitiveness goes in dynamic economic environments, and globalization is generally a very dynamic global economic environment. Large changes in relative economic power and perceived power. And that's, of course, happened in the last 20 years, 30 years with China to an extraordinary degree. And that adds, and the most obvious comparison, I wrote a very recent column on this, is, of course, the period before the First World War. Much discussed parallel, but I think it's a good parallel. These very large shifts in relative power lead to a combination of fear and resentment. Fear, particularly among those who feel they're falling relatively behind, and resentment in the country and economy that feels it is now much more powerful than it used to be and is not being treated appropriately. And I think the latter perception is very important for the Chinese. And the former is certainly very important in the West. So the economic macro imbalance tensions and trade tensions are linked very closely with geopolitical tensions. And we might say they're other side of a single coin, two sides of one coin. And history suggests it's very difficult to manage these. And of course, this is a big theme. This side of it is a big theme of Gray and Allison's Thucydides' Trap book.
All right. Our next question is mainly directed at Michael. Michael, you argued that China under Xi might be on its way to the kind of hard authoritarianism necessary to redistribute the debt burden into the right stakeholders. I wonder if the anti-corruption campaign is part of that, or if perhaps it has so aggravated the elites that if Xi tries to dump the debt on them, that may sort of be the straw breaking the camel's back, leading to an internal power struggle. How do you view the anti-corruption campaign in this light, and sort of with your hypothesis?
Well, all I can, it's obviously a very sensitive topic, so I'm not going to discuss it very much. All I can say is that I do think the anti-corruption campaign was fundamental to this re-centralization of power. It's the mechanism that was used to re-centralize power. That's very, very clear. It's also very clear that there's a great deal of resentment, but it's very hidden resentment towards Xi. And not surprisingly, he put half of them in jail. So I think that continues. What that does to the stability of the system, I'm not smart enough to say, and I certainly don't have the insider knowledge to say. But what I will say is that I'm treading on areas that I don't really want to discuss publicly.
All right, next question is on the GDP numbers that came out this morning. So for both Michael and Martin, and I guess we'll start with Martin since Michael took the last question. How do you view the 3.2% quarterly growth rate? First, is it believable? And second, if believable, how did that happen? If not, what do you think really happened?
I'm very happy to say I don't know the answer to any of these questions, not least because for me, this started at 9 in the morning and I was working on a monstrous book review before we started. So my study of these data has been completely inadequate. I have a broad perception on Chinese GDP data, which are, I never really believe them. But I tend to think they're telling you something about the broad direction of things, though they tend to understate the booms and understate the slumps. That's sort of my perception of where they are. So I don't really, if I'm told that the second quarter growth was 3.2%, I mean, to me, given that, that we're only just out of it, that no other country in the world thinks it can produce GDP numbers which are reliable at a time a few weeks after the second quarter has ended. To me, this obviously tells you that these aren't GDP numbers that one understands them in, say, the US or the UK. And there is also the problem, which Michael has written about very extensively, of what GDP means in a semi-command, it's not a command economy, but in an economy in which normal financial relationships don't hold. So my broad answer is I have no idea what they mean, but I do think it is plausible that GDP recovered in the second quarter because they seem to have controlled the virus, and China is in general an economy that has been, so far as I can see, growing.
Basically I agree with everything Martin says. I think GDP means something in China, but it doesn't mean what we think it means. It's not comparable with GDP in other countries. In China, GDP isn't an output. In most countries, things happen, you measure the output of those things, and then you figure out what was the change in output over that period, and that's your growth number. In China, except for this year, I've been able to predict GDP with astonishing accuracy every year, a year before the year ended. Now, it's not a big deal. Everyone can do that. It's just the GDP growth target. In China, GDP growth is an input determined by the government, and they're able to achieve it basically through an accounting difference. Imagine if there were two Chinas that are identical, exactly the same people doing exactly the same things. The difference is just an accounting treatment. In one China, when you invest in a non-productive enterprise, you invest $100 and produce something worth 20, you write it down more or less in line with other countries. It doesn't have to be perfect. And in the other China, you don't. You capitalize the full expense. You treat it as a $100 investment, a $100 asset. Well, in the first China, that writing down would reduce the value added component of the GDP calculation. So the first China would show a lower GDP growth number than the second China. And it's that first China's GDP growth number that is comparable to GDP growth in the US or England or Brazil or wherever you like. That would be the comparable number. We get the second number. Now, it's not nonsense, it's real economic activity. It's economic activity in which what should be an expense is effectively capitalized, in which something that's worth zero is given a positive value. So it tells us about economic activity, and I think it's reasonable, as Martin mentions. It's incredibly stable, so it probably smooths out booms and busts, but otherwise it tells us something about activity. It just didn't tell us about the increase in wealth in China. It told us about the increase in economic activity, productive or non-productive.
Michael, this morning's data, to me, they look like a supply side success, but
Yes.
a consumption demand side question mark.
Yes. In fact, I was really surprised at the market reaction because the growth numbers were better than expected. And I thought the market would have surged, and it didn't. It dropped pretty substantially, or at least it did when I came here. Who knows where it is now? And I would argue that that's probably because, for the reasons you say, the consumption numbers were really disappointing. So the question then becomes, what do you think COVID-19 was? Was it a demand side shock or was it a supply side shock? Well, it was a little bit of both, but I think it was mostly a demand side shock, in which case I would argue that the solution is policies that boost the demand side rather than the supply side. But if you look at what China has done, with the exception of a few consumption coupons, et cetera, almost everything it's done has been a supply side boost. And that means that the only way China can resolve it is either with a much higher trade surplus, which indeed we've seen, or with much more non-productive domestic public sector investment. And I think what the market has said is that that's not good. That's not what we want to see.
All right, on to the next question. Is it possible that some of the new infrastructure investments may over time become profitable and productive and give real business cases to affect demand rather than the supply side? And in which sectors do you think this is most promising, and in what kind of timeline? I assume this question is mainly focused on the new infrastructure plan, focusing a lot on energy, renewables, telecoms, things like that.
You want to address that, Martin?
No, I thought, well, I think our views might diverge a little on this. I mean, my general assumption with Chinese investment, and this is really based on nothing very sophisticated, is go something like this. And Michael hasn't emphasized this side of the picture, but it's been very much the way I've emphasized it. As he said, after 2008, this is relevant to this, I think, the debt blew up. And the debt blew up in support of the most striking thing that happened after 2008 from a macro Keynesian point of view, which is a huge rise in investment rates from what were already pretty well the highest investment rates any large economy had ever managed in the history of the world. So according to their figures, which I think at least are illuminating, the investment share of GDP rose after 2008, roughly from 40% of GDP to close to 50. Now, we know there are problems with these figures, but the comparison is probably correct. And that's the counterpart of the disappearance of the current account surplus. At the same time, after 2 or 3 years of this super driven, investment driven growth, which is the most extreme case of Michael's story about GDP you could imagine, the Chinese downgraded their growth targets and their growth rates from about 10% a year to 6 or so. Let's assume that the figures aren't right, but the cut is right in terms of activity. So here you have a country which enormously increased its investment rate and enormously reduced, and this is enormous, its rate of growth. And it isn't terribly difficult to conclude from this that the marginal return on investment must have been 0 to highly negative. And that, I think, And though investment has fallen back a bit since then, it's still extraordinarily, staggeringly high for an economy which is only growing at 6% or so. And as a result, one simple measure of the return on investment, very crude, the incremental capital output ratio is extraordinarily high in China, just extraordinary, and roughly double what it used to be 15 years ago. So I think the conclusion for that is very straightforward. A lot of investment at the margin is a complete waste. And it would be much better if they consumed it and the economy would grow just as fast as it does now. What proportion of that? I have no idea. But Michael's argument from a macro stability point of view also applies. You know, why not consume it? Because the investment isn't worthwhile. However, this is my final comment, there are clearly questions about the composition of this investment. And it is very plausible to me, looking at what they've been investing in, you know, part of what they invested in there were a hell of a lot more steel mills, which obviously they've stopped. That there are the composition of investment should change a lot towards public investment, public things like hospitals and all the rest of it, public consumption goods, towards renewables, energy efficiency, the environment, and so forth. I'm sure that within this diminished investment envelope, I mean, the sort of rates of investment in China have been stupefying. Within a diminished investment envelope, movement in the directions described in the question would make very good sense, and some of those investments would have very high economic and social return. So I suspect that the Chinese investment needs to shrink relative to GDP, and consumption needs to rise for the reasons we've discussed, but also shifts in the composition of the type you're describing. I don't know where the details at all make lots of sense. And of course, China is a developing country and should be investing a lot, but it will be investing a lot by historical standards, even if it invested very significantly less.
As we're coming to the end of this session, and this is our book month where we're going to introduce 7 books. Martin, I'm curious about, as you discuss the big book review that's up your sleeve. So which book are you going to discuss?
Oh, I didn't know I was supposed to. Did you tell me that I was going to have to discuss a book? Let him discuss a book, and then I will decide which book, yeah, why don't I, there are so many different books, but let me discuss a book, if I may, very, very briefly, which I think is important and has nothing to do with China. And this is the book by Anne Case and Angus Deaton. There are many other interesting books, which is called Deaths of Despair. And it's about what I think is the single most telling statistic about the United States, which they discovered, which is that since 2000, for the first time since the beginning, since the 19th century, in any major industrial country, there has been a significant fall in life expectancy and rise in mortality rates, essentially due to one part of the population, middle-aged white people, particularly middle-aged white people who didn't go to college. And they discovered this, Anne actually discovered this. They wrote a very seminal paper about it, which shocked the world. Interestingly, since then, we now see very similar phenomena in the UK for the last 2 or 3 years. And my own view is this obviously is a very important part, not the only part, but it's an important part of explaining the politics that elected Trump and caused Brexit. That is to say, and of course, a lot of it's blamed on globalization. That is to say, a significant part of our population has not benefited from continued growth. There has been continued productivity growth, not as strong as there used to be, but a very significant proportion of the population has not benefited, and they become very angry and very despairing at the same time. And Mr. Trump is a genius at articulating both anger and despair. So I think if we want to understand the social state and political condition of the US, which after all is still the most important country in the world. The Case Deaton book is immensely illuminating, and the research underlying it was path-breaking. And it tells you something really important, which is that progress is not linear. And life expectancy is, I suppose, probably the rise in life expectancy is the single most potent measure of progress.
Any book recommendations from your side?
Well, if you haven't read Martin's book, I strongly recommend it. I'm not saying it because he's on there, but it's just such a useful way of thinking about the world. I think Adam Tooze's book is really good. I'm reading, I don't know if you've read it, Martin, Irwin's really fat book on trade that came out quite recently. I don't remember the title, but it's a very sort of almost year-by-year account for masochists of trade policy in the United States, from Hamilton until today. And I personally find it really interesting. I'm not sure everybody else will, but it's a good book, Martin, in case you haven't read it.
Well, that brings us to, yeah, that brings us to the end of this session. And of course, this is the book to read. It is possibly available outside Beijing anywhere easily. And I would like to remind everyone that we have the next session on the 21st of July, as we have the new book, Superpower Showdown by Bob Davis and Wei-Ling Ling, both Wall Street Journal, and we are lucky to have Mrs. WTO, Charlie Barshevsky, as the moderator. But let me really thank you, Martin in London, as well as Michael here, for doing this session for us. I think it was enlightening for all of us, and I wish you all a very good day. Thank you.